No, no idea at all.
No idea.
Don't get an idea, sir.
Such a difficult question.
I think you should call him, otherwise Shipriya will not shut up.
He has been member of Toastmasters since when? Any idea?
15 years.
1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years.
4 years or 5 years.
Home club members, please don't answer. Home club members, please don't answer.
13 years. 9 years.
A whole lot of 15 years.
Whoa.
He is member of Toastmasters from 2003.
Whoa.
I do not.
16 years, I told you.
Shipriya, you were not born. Mentally.
When he is currently managing director and CEO of a Japanese subsidiary in India. As a speaker, when he comes on the stage, none of the audience member dare to see here or there because he is glued to the stage on the way of his articulation, the way he manages stage presence and the presence of mind. We all are fan of this powerful speaker. So please welcome with huge round of applause Ashok Ashta, the spiritual leadership, Ashok Ashta.
Thank you, Mukesh, for this very warm introduction. On a cold day like this, it helps me warm up. I'm here today to articulate my vision for spiritual leadership with a focus on compassion as a construct in leadership. Fellow Toastmasters and dear guests, good evening to you all.
Good evening.
My speech is structured in 3 parts. The first talks about leadership in general. The second talks about spirituality. And third, as we learned, it's not enough to have a vision. We must also have some idea of how to activate it. But first, let's talk about leadership. Earlier this evening, somebody asked, what does leadership mean? And we had the general confusion that prevails in academia, in scholarship, and amongst practitioners. Leadership as a concept has been studied for over 100 years, and there is still no consensus of what is leadership. Till the 1930s, the academics thought of leadership and wrote about the power dynamic that is involved with leaders. And somewhere around the 30s, the scholarship changed to talking about traits. What are traits that a leader has? Some of these traits would be a leader has energy, a leader is sincere, and so on. After World War II, people started talking about leadership behavior. Is someone task-oriented, or is she relationship-oriented? And we had the emergence in later years on these themes of task-oriented and transformational leadership. Somewhere around the 60s, the whole idea of influence started coming into the management literature on leadership. How can people influence others to achieve a common goal? All this continued, and somewhere around the 80s there was a sudden sprouting of a lot of papers in many journals on leadership is this, leadership is that, and you had leadership institutes. And yet, while all this was being studied, scandals continued. Somewhere around the turn of the century, we had in America, where a lot of this scholarship is happening, the Gulf oil spill, the Enron scandal. relevant to us in India. In the 80s, we had the Bofors scandal. In the 90s, we had the Harshad Mehta scandal. In the early 2000s, in the area of sports, the Ajay Jadeja and the match fixing scandal. All this continued, and even though all this literature was coming up on leadership. And therefore, at the turn of the century, leading strategists like Mintzberg, they called for a greater understanding on the process of leadership, and they called for attention to what is called ethical leadership. Within the whole idea of ethical leadership, leading scholars like Yokel and Nordhaus talk about three different ideas that can come under the entire superset of ethical leadership, and one of these is authentic leadership, another is servant leadership, but what I want to focus on today is spiritual leadership. And within spiritual leadership, I will talk more on compassion, and I'll explain to you why. So we have the whole idea of leadership, ethical leadership, spiritual leadership, and compassion. Somewhere around here, which you can also see. Now, what is spirituality? Spirituality means different things to different people. And one of them is what we all understand, the transcendence, where we pray to a higher power that all of us, or many of us, refer to as God, some as a higher power. The second one is, in spirituality, is about our innerness. And we meditate and try and find out who we are, the real us. A third aspect is the well-being aspect of spirituality when we talk about happiness. But the fourth aspect is about interconnectedness. How do we all relate to each other? How do we relate to the birds and the fauna? And that interconnected theme is related to compassion. And that is what I consider an important aspect of spiritual leadership and leadership in general. Compassion. How do we think about this now in practical terms? The action part of things. I often bring up the idea in the West of two companies, one Amazon and one Google. Now Amazon, if you read an article in the New York Times, maybe a few years ago, but they talked about the problems there with the transactional leader style that goes on in Amazon, where you have people who are actually sitting on their desks and crying because of the pressure to achieve targets, and that is the sole driving purpose of that organization. This is from the New York Times, it's public information, and I have no problem sharing this with you. On the other hand, we also have Google, an aspirational workplace where many of the people that I know who work there and others who aspire to work there look forward to going into work. When I read such stories, I think to myself, what kind of company I would like to be leading. I was charged with leading Minibia subsidiary in India. And this was a time for me to think, what can I do to create something that people would enjoy working in? And therefore, I have been taking steps to make this MNC in India more relevant to the employees in India. One example is there are different work rules and expectations in the Japanese organization, but how to make them relevant for Indians and creating an India relevant, for example, work rules. Creating India relevant expectations of the employees. Compassion in leadership and spirituality in leadership does not have to be yes it's there or no it's not. There can be different scales, and I encourage you to join me in moving from the less compassion to more compassion. In the Indian context, you might think Amazon, Google. I asked you to consider two names, and I won't say which is which, but perhaps you will come to your own conclusions. Would you rather be creating a company like, and I'll be forceful here, would you rather be creating a company like Reliance, or would you rather be creating a company like Tata? to answer in either way would be a very political statement. But by creating this thought in your mind, and you will come to your own conclusions on what kind of company you would like to create, I urge you to act on what you wish to do. Very similar to me acting on my love and not caring about what people talk about. Very similar to that. Think, if you want to be the Google of the world, and I'm talking in a corporate context simply because I come from a corporate background, but this could be in politics, it could be in NPOs, it could be in NGOs, it could be in sports. Think about, like I do, about what it is that you want people to enjoy doing with you. That thinking about others is what I refer to as compassion, and that is my vision, that we talk about it, we act on it, we enhance compassion in leadership in India and the world. Mr. Costa.